The 1,970 seconds were a golden age for horror. While sharks, space battles, and possessed children dominated the headlines, a stranger story was happening in the shadows. Studios quietly buried films that were too eerie, too experimental, or just too far ahead of their time. These supernatural nightmares slipped past the mainstream, but they still leave chills decades later. So, are you ready to step off the blockbuster path and unearth the hidden classics that streaming forgot? Let's scare Jessica to death. 1971. Picture this. A quiet farmhouse surrounded by apple orchards, mist rolling across a lake, and the faint sound of church bells. It looks like peace, right? Not in Let's Scare Jessica to Death. What starts as a fresh start for a fragile woman turns into one of the decade's most unnerving ghost stories. Jessica, played with delicate intensity by Zora Lampert, has just left a mental hospital. She wants a simple life with her husband and friends in the countryside, but every creak of the old house, every strange glance from the locals, whispers something darker. The film drips with paranoia, making you question if Jessica's mind is breaking again or if something ancient is lurking in the water nearby. Director John Hancock had barely $1 million to spend, so he leaned on atmosphere. Hidden speakers piped eerie sounds onto the set to keep the cast genuinely unsettled. That nervous energy translated straight onto the screen. Critics dismissed it at the time, but over the years, its influence has grown. Indie horror films like The Blair Witch Project owe plenty to Jessica's creeping sense of dread. This is not a jump-scare roller coaster, it's a slow drip of unease that seeps into your bones. The result? A cult classic that still feels strangely modern and unnervingly fragile. You can't easily stream it, but if you track it down, you'll discover why whispers about this film have never fully gone quiet. The Other 1972. Golden sunlight, white picket, fences, and twin boys running through open fields. At first glance, The Other feels like a slice of nostalgic Americana. But stay a while, and you'll see those postcard images twist into something far more chilling. Directed by Robert Mulligan, the same man who gave us To Kill a Mockingbird, The Other follows identical twins, Niles and Holland Perry, on a Connecticut farm. Their games seem innocent until small tragedies start piling up. A toy hidden away, a neighbor's accident, whispers of family secrets. Every scene peels back the surface of small-town life, showing how easily innocence can mask dread. Mulligan filmed the story in sequence, from spring to fall, letting the young actors naturally grow with the narrative. He even slipped fake pages into the script so their reactions would stay authentic when the truth unfolded. Jerry Goldsmith's score starts light and airy, then slowly mutates into something that feels less like a lullaby and more like a funeral march. Audiences in 1972 weren't interested. The Godfather overshadowed everything, and The Other slipped quietly away. But its legacy is undeniable. The creepy child trope that dominated horror for decades owes a heavy debt to Mulligan's twins. What makes this film endure isn't gore or spectacle. It's the slow, suffocating feeling that the picture-perfect family life we admire can rot from the inside. You won't find it on major platforms, but if you ever stumble across it, prepare for a slow dive into pure unease. The Possession of Joel Delaney, 1972. New York City in the early 70 seconds was a glittering skyline sitting on crumbling streets. Into this landscape came The Possession of Joel Delaney, a film that dared to mix the supernatural with the fractures of privilege and class. Shirley MacLaine stars as Nora, a wealthy woman from the Upper East Side whose brother Joel suddenly begins acting strangely. At first it looks like mental collapse, but soon the truth emerges. Joel is overtaken by the vengeful spirit of a man from the city's harsher neighborhoods. What unfolds isn't just a haunting, it's a clash between sheltered wealth and a world it pretends not to see. Director Waris Hussein used handheld 16mm cameras during possession sequences, splicing them against polished studio shots. The result is jagged, jarring, and deeply unsettling. Sound design heightened the discomfort with reversed animal noises warped into human growls, giving Joel's breakdowns an uncanny edge. The movie was released opposite The Godfather, which meant it never had a chance at box office glory. Critics were unsettled by its bleak tone, but modern viewers see something braver. Strip away the rotary phones and bell-bottoms, and what you have is a chilling mirror about how people ignore the struggles around them until it walks right into their living room. The possession of Joel Delaney may not have the fame of The Exorcist, but in its own way, it's sharper, colder, and more grounded in social fear. Too strange to be mainstream, too bold to vanish completely, it's one of the decade's forgotten treasures. Messiah of Evil, 1973. If nightmares had postcards, they'd look like Messiah of Evil. Forget misty castles and European villages. This film plants its horror on the neon-soaked California coast, where beachside sunsets twist into visions of dread. The story follows Arletty, a young woman searching for her missing father in a seaside town where nothing feels right. The locals drift through the streets with blank eyes and slack faces, moving as if under a spell, waiting for something unspeakable. What she uncovers isn't a mystery so much as a waking dream that steadily unravels into terror. Few films capture unease the way this one does. Entire sequences feel like they've been ripped from a half-remembered nightmare. A fluorescent supermarket where aisles stretch into infinity. A movie theater where the audience sits disturbingly silent and lifeless. A seaside mansion lined with shifting murals that make the walls themselves feel alive. Every frame is drenched in atmosphere. Husband and wife filmmakers Willard Hoyk and Gloria Katz weren't aiming for mainstream thrills. With cinematographer Stephen Katz, they washed scenes in sickly reds and cold blues, creating a palette that feels both hypnotic and suffocating. The sound design added another layer of disorientation, with distorted recordings and ambient noises that made audiences feel trapped inside the characters' hallucinations. Released in 1973, Messiah of Evil was quickly overshadowed by juggernauts like The Exorcist. Critics were baffled, audiences stayed away, and it slipped into obscurity. But over the years, it grew into a cult phenomenon. Directors like Guillermo del Toro have praised it as a forgotten bridge between European art cinema and modern slow-burn horror. Messiah of Evil may never have conquered the mainstream, but once you see it, you'll understand why it endures. It isn't just a horror movie, it's a dream you can't quite shake off, long after waking. The Legend of Hell House, 1973. Before ghost hunting shows filled late-night television, there was The Legend of Hell House, a haunted mansion tale so intense it felt less like entertainment and more like a clinical study in fear. Released in 1973, the film was adapted from Richard Matheson's novel and directed by John Huff, who leaned into atmosphere and psychological tension over cheap tricks. The story follows a group of paranormal investigators locked inside the infamous Belasco House, a sprawling estate with a reputation for swallowing anyone who dares enter. Their mission is simple on paper: prove whether spirits exist. But with electromagnetic equipment buzzing and psychic mediums straining to connect, what begins as research quickly becomes a descent into chaos. The house doesn't just test them, it consumes them. Huff's approach elevated the material beyond campfire scares. Wide-angle lenses bent the geometry of rooms into unsettling shapes, while sound engineers experimented with deep, infrasonic tones that rattled theater seats and unnerved audiences on a physical level. Filming inside a decaying British mansion gave the setting an authenticity that couldn't be faked. The house feels alive, like a predator circling its prey. While audiences of the early 70 seconds turned out modestly, critics admired the intelligence behind the scares. Over the years, the film's reputation grew. Stephen King credited it as a major influence on his own haunted house fiction, and echoes of its style can be found in Poltergeist, The Conjuring, and even Netflix's The Haunting of Hill House. What makes The Legend of Hell House endure is its seriousness. This isn't a carnival ride of slamming doors and cheap shrieks. It's the disturbing suggestion that a structure itself can feed on human weakness. Overshadowed in its own era, the film still stands today as one of the sharpest and most unsettling haunted house classics ever made. The Evil 1978. Every decade has its forgotten gem, and for the 70 seconds, that crown belongs to the evil. On paper, it looks simple. A psychiatrist and his wife buy a decaying New Mexico mansion with plans to turn it into a rehab center. But the land is cursed, the house is angry, and the basement hides a gateway you definitely don't want to open. Director Gus Triconis had just $700,000 to work with, so he leaned on pure atmosphere. The house wasn't a set, it was a crumbling mansion that looked ready to collapse on its own. That real-world rot seeps into every frame. One sequence still rattles horror fans, a man dragged screaming through the floor by invisible hands long before Hollywood had the budget to make such effects look polished. Here, the rawness makes it hit harder. Richard Crenna, usually known for tough guy roles, plays the lead with surprising vulnerability. Joanna Pettit anchors the story with a sharp performance that balances the supernatural chaos with emotional weight. Supporting actors bring the right amount of grit, grounding the madness in something that feels frighteningly human. The Evil didn't have a chance in 1978, released against bigger horror titles with more marketing muscle. But those who stumbled across it on late-night television or VHS never forgot it. It has since grown into a cult favorite, praised for its scrappy style and relentless set pieces. What makes The Evil stand out today is its unpolished energy. It's rough, unpredictable, and brimming with eerie moments that sneak under your skin. It may not sit beside The Exorcist in the history books, but in many ways, it's scarier, because it feels like something that could happen in your own home. Deathdream, 1974. Imagine the doorbell ringing, and your son, buried months ago after Vietnam, walks back into the house. He's pale, silent, and unmistakably wrong. That's the opening of Deathdream, also known as Dead of Night, a 1974 shocker from Bob Clark, the same director who would later bring the world A Christmas Story. This time, though, there are no warm memories, only dread creeping in frame by frame. The story centers on Andy Brooks, a soldier killed in action who inexplicably returns home alive. At first, his family embraces the miracle, but relief quickly curdles into terror. Andy is cold, detached, his skin tinged with an unnatural gray. As days pass, his condition worsens. He withdraws from human connection, his eyes empty, his body craving sustenance no ordinary food can provide. Behind the scenes, a young Tom Savini created the unforgettable makeup. He mixed crushed mothballs into foundation to give Andy's flesh a waxy, lifeless hue that still unsettles viewers. Some sequences were shot guerrilla-style in real cemeteries without permits, which meant the actors' unease was genuine, their nervous glances weren't staged. That raw energy bleeds into every frame, making the horror feel uncomfortably real. When it premiered, Deathdream was drowned out by bigger names like The Exorcist. Critics barely looked, and audiences moved on. But over time, the film found its reputation. Beneath the undead story lies a powerful metaphor. Andy isn't simply a monster. He's the embodiment of trauma, of young men who came home from war, changed in ways families couldn't understand. Bleak, slow-burning, and unforgettable, Deathdream doesn't rely on cheap tricks. It asks a scarier question. What if the person who comes home isn't really the same? And what if the war didn't just take them away, it brought something broken back in their place? Burnt Offerings, 1976. Vacations are supposed to restore you. In Burnt Offerings, the vacation house restores itself by draining the life out of its tenants. Directed by Dan Curtis, the man behind Dark Shadows, this haunted mansion tale is one of the 70 seconds most underrated chillers. The story follows Marion and Ben Rolfe, played by Karen Black and Oliver Reed, who rent a massive estate for the summer with their young son. The deal seems too good to be true, and of course it island. As the family moves in, the house begins repairing itself. Shutters gleam, gardens bloom, and the walls grow fresh again, all while the humans inside start to unravel. One of the film's creepiest touches is the chauffeur, a grinning figure from Ben's childhood nightmares who keeps reappearing. Played by Anthony James, his silent stare became a horror image people still talk about decades later. Filming was grueling, done in triple-digit California heat, and Reed's sweat-drenched descent into madness wasn't just acting, it was survival. Bette Davis, then nearly 70, took on the role of the family's elderly aunt and insisted on doing her own stunts, climbing stairs without oxygen support. Director Curtis hid oxygen tanks around the set in case she collapsed. That kind of commitment added a raw edge to the film's already tense atmosphere. Burnt Offerings was overshadowed at the box office by the flashier release of Carrie. But time has been kind. Scholars now see it as a key link between Shirley Jackson-style Gothic horror and modern real estate nightmares like the Amityville Horror. If you've ever felt a house watching you back, Burnt Offerings is proof you weren't imagining it. The Sentinel, 1977. A charming Manhattan brownstone in Brooklyn Heights offered at a suspiciously low price. Sounds like a dream rental, right? Except in The Sentinel, that dream hides a nightmare. Directed by Michael Winner, this supernatural classic turns city living into an urban trap you can't escape. Allison Parker, a model played by Christina Rains, moves into the brownstone, thrilled at the deal, but her new neighbors are off. They seem quirky at first, then unsettling, and finally inhuman. The truth is worse than any leaky faucet. The building sits on a gateway, and Allison is being groomed to serve as its eternal guard. Universal gave the production a solid budget, and it shows. The cast is stacked: Ava Gardner, Burgess Meredith, Christopher Walken, and even a young Jeff Goldblum make appearances. But the film is remembered not for its star power, but for its disturbing finale. Winner controversially used real sideshow performers to portray the damned, sparking debates in film ethics circles that continue today. Visually, the movie is striking. Cinematographer Dick Cretina shot migraine sequences through smeared glass to mimic distorted vision, while the soundtrack blended eerie chants with early synthesizer tones. The result is a constant sensory assault that keeps you on edge. Released the same year as Star Wars, The Sentinel barely made a dent at the box office, but horror fans never forgot it. Its bleak atmosphere and surreal ending have kept it alive as a cult favorite. If haunted houses scare you, this one makes entire city blocks feel cursed. The Manitou, 1978. A woman checks into a San Francisco hospital with what doctors think is a tumor on her neck. But when surgeons cut into it, they find something worse: a fetus. Not a human one, but the reincarnated spirit of an ancient figure. That's the setup for the Manitou, one of the wildest supernatural rides the 70 Seconds ever unleashed. Directed by William Girdler and starring Tony Curtis, the film throws everything at the screen. The practical effects team kept prosthetics refrigerated so they wouldn't melt under studio lights. Air pumps under the actress's skin made the growth pulsate unnaturally. By the final act, hospital rooms transform into deep space as lasers battle spirits. It's over the top, bizarre, and unforgettable. Audiences in 1978 weren't sure how to handle it. Critics laughed at its campy tone, and it barely made back its budget. But decades later, horror fans see it differently. The Manitou is admired for its audacity. It mixes body horror, mysticism, and cosmic spectacle in ways that mainstream horror never dared. Composer Lalo Schifrin delivered one of his strangest scores, fusing haunting chants with electronic flourishes. That soundscape alone could give you goosebumps. And Tony Curtis, usually remembered for lighter roles, throws himself fully into the madness, delivering lines with the conviction of a man battling the impossible. The Manitou isn't elegant, but that's the point. It's messy, chaotic, and alive with ideas. Watching it feels less like following a story and more like tumbling into a fever dream. For fans willing to embrace its weirdness, it remains one of the most unique horror films of its decade. The Medusa Touch, 1978. What if your darkest thoughts didn't just stay in your head, but shattered the world around you? That's the terrifying premise of The Medusa Touch, a British supernatural thriller that dared to go big while most haunted tales stayed small. Richard Burton stars as John Morlar, a bitter novelist with telekinetic powers so destructive they could topple civilizations. Director Jack Gold went all in on spectacle. Special effects wizard John Richardson constructed a 60-foot replica of St. Paul's Cathedral, only to blow it apart with 200 pounds of explosives. Bridges collapse, planes crash, and skyscrapers buckle, not from natural disaster, but from one man's fury. Burton, legendary for his volcanic screen presence, rewrote his monologues nightly while sipping vodka disguised in teacups. His gravelly delivery makes Morlar feel less like a villain and more like a doomed prophet. The score adds another layer, with distorted choir recordings that sound both angelic and corrupted, echoing Burton's conflicted character. Released in the UK, the film made a splash, but in the US, it was quickly buried by juggernauts like Halloween. Still, its scale and ambition stood apart. While most supernatural horror stuck to basements and attics, the Medusa Touch asked, what if a single mind could unravel entire nations? It's uneven, sometimes melodramatic, but unforgettable. Watching it now feels strangely current. We're used to superheroes wielding powers that can shake the planet, but here, it's a misanthropic writer who wants nothing more than to burn the world down. Overshadowed by leaner horror, the Medusa Touch remains one of the most daring supernatural visions of its decade. The Brood 1979. Some horrors come from haunted houses. Others come from the people we love. David Cronenberg's The Brood skips ghostly tricks and digs straight into emotional wounds, turning family trauma into physical monsters. The film follows Frank, played by Art Hindle, as he battles for custody of his daughter. His estranged wife, Nola, is under the care of experimental therapist Dr. Raglan, portrayed with icy precision by Oliver Reed. Raglan's therapy technique forces patients to physically manifest their rage. In Nola's case, that rage gives birth to twisted children who act on her anger. Filmed on a lean $1.5 million budget in the freezing Ontario winter, production was brutal. Child actors playing the creatures were stuffed with hot water bottles inside their suits just to survive the cold. Samantha Eggar's infamous climactic scene, involving a grotesque birth, reportedly had crew members gagging behind the camera. Cronenberg, going through a bitter divorce himself, poured every ounce of personal anguish into the film. Audiences in 1979 weren't sure what to think. Alien dominated theaters, and The Brood seemed too strange, too raw. But over time, it found its audience. Martin Scorsese even praised it as one of the most powerful horror films of its era. What makes The Brood endure is its honesty. The monsters aren't just creatures, they're physical embodiments of rage, grief, and broken love. Cronenberg didn't craft a popcorn scare machine. He gave us therapy in its darkest form, a horror film that cuts into wounds we'd rather not touch. It's unsettling, personal, and unforgettable. So there you have it, 12 supernatural nightmares from the 70 seconds that never got the blockbuster spotlight and still aren't easy to stream. They may not have the polish of big studio hits, but that's exactly what makes them feel alive, raw, eerie, and one step away from reality. Which one of these hidden gems would you dare to track down first? Drop your pick in the comments, share this list with your fellow horror fans, and don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten treasures from cinema's dark vault. Until next time, keep your screen glowing and your nerves steady.